ihr wissen, eins müsst ihr dann wissen, man hört es dann gerne.
Ah, man hört das hier? Ah, ein bisschen nur.
Ja, ja. Nee, also wenn du sprichst.
sinking in. Nobody wants to play pretend. I just know that I'm feeling like we just begun. Nothing's ever good enough. Tenderness is all I've got. Yeah, I'm feeling like we just begun. Nothing's ever good enough. Tenderness is all I've got.
Ja, es geht gut.
far it can take me before it forsakes me. Julie Range Rover, she's riding it. She pulled it up fast and I got in it. How do you sleep at the end of the day? When you close your eyes, all you see is her face. I pulled it out the card and leave the dirt on it. Popped it in my mouth just to be sure of it. How do you sleep at the end of the day? When you close your eyes, all you see is her face. I wanna live, 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 Singing Julie Range, Rover, she's riding it. Little piece of me always alive in it. How do you sleep at the end of the day? When you close your eyes, all you see is her face. I wanna live, 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 I wanna I wanna live, 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 I wanna singing Nicky Range Rover, you're alive in it. You know I'm never gonna stop driving it. Now you can sleep at the end of the day. When I close my eyes, all I see is your face. Anything, if ever there was anything that could change this thing that's happening. If ever there was anything, it was different then. Distant feeling when you lose a friend. It hurts to look at what he used to be. I miss you and it's sad 'cause that's what's meant for me. You know, I don't have anything. I wish I could treat you the same as I did when we was both in love. Anything we did, I was not enough. Now it's gone, I don't have anything. Anything, if ever there was anything that could change this thing that's happening. If ever there was anything, where have I gone? Where have I gone? I'm just myself done wrong. I feel it, yeah, I kick myself around. I lost it, it was everything, and now it's done. You know, I don't have anything. I wish I could treat you the same as I did when
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Where's our tech person? Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Weißt du, wo die hin sind?
Ich glaube jetzt noch nicht.
Good morning. Good morning. Nee, oder? Can you hear me? No. Yeah? Good morning, everyone. And a warm welcome. No? Warum ist keiner? Good morning. Hello. 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 Can you hear? Perfect. Good morning. So, dear Undersecretary Jenkins, dear Sanam, dear Mahbouba, hopefully she can hear us, dear Leandra, dear Mr. Rachman, welcome to our event and thank you for being with us today. I have the pleasure to welcome you to our event, War, Oppression and Strongmen, Rethinking the Role of Anti-Feminism in Autocratic Regimes. My name is Dina Bernarding. I'm one of the co-founders of the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, which I'm co-leading with my colleague and the other co-founder, Christina Lunz, right there. We are a research advocacy organization that promotes a feminist approach to foreign and security policy. So an approach that really disrupts power inequalities and that focuses on the perspective and the needs of the most marginalized. 3 years ago, our organization, CFFP, was the first one to bring a feminist foreign policy to the Munich Security Conference. And I just spoke to Christina. Back then it was her and myself. And now we have a team of 15 amazing people and who have also been incredibly supportive for making this event happening today, such as Ariane, who is here today. Thank you. Already back then in 2020, we had the amazing opportunity to co-host the event with the International Civil Society Action Network, sorry, Sanam, which is led by Sanam, who's also one of the panelists later today. This year, we're also co-hosting this event with the German Council on Foreign Relations, and I also would like to really thank the BMW Foundation Herbert Quandt for hosting us again this year.
Good morning, dear distinguished speakers, dear guests. Also on behalf of DGAP, the German Council on Foreign Relations, it is my great pleasure to welcome you this morning to this event on such an important topic. And I'd also like to thank you all for attending in such a great number, despite the early hour. I am Dana Schirborn. I am a research fellow at DGAP, where we also work on how to implement feminist foreign policy from a policy perspective. I would like to especially thank the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy as well as the International Civil Society Action Network for all the incredible work they put into this event, but also into pioneering feminist foreign policy, both at MSc and beyond. I'm delighted that we are able to partner with you on this occasion and on this event. Thank you very much.
In his speech on the 24th of February last year, Russian President Vladimir Putin justified his war on Ukraine by, amongst other things, fighting the West's attempt to destroy Russia's traditional values. The marginalization of women and LGBTQI people and communities is not only an essential part of authoritarian structures in Russia, but also, for example, in Belarus. And also in countries like Hungary or Poland, classified as hybrid or semi-consolidated democracies, the fight against women and LGBTQI rights is an essential part of the anti-democratic developments that we are witnessing. And beyond Europe, the current crisis in Iran and Afghanistan clearly show how the discrimination of women is not only the basis but also the expression of authoritarian regimes. In these contexts, anti-feminism really serves a wide range of purposes. For example, to create a national identity, to build national or international alliances, to justify or legitimize the restriction of the freedom of the media, for example, and also to justify wars of aggression abroad. And this comes as no surprise. We know from feminist research that the greater inequalities are within a state, the more likely the state is to experience fragility, terrorism, or conflict.
Anti-feminist attitudes by authoritarian leadership and regimes also come to light when we look at other issues that also affect human security. It is no coincidence that authoritarian regimes also push against efforts tackling the climate crisis and sometimes even deny climate change as such. These regimes not only severely exploit the environment and destroy rare ecosystems, they also violently oppress those speaking up for the environment, especially indigenous groups. Every second day, globally, an environmental activist is being murdered, almost half of them being members of indigenous groups. An integral part of feminist action in policymaking and beyond needs to always push against these anti-feminist structures, actors and violence on all levels and everywhere. Anti-feminism is present in every context and often comes with racist, anti-Semitic and conspiracy ideologies. The German context is no exempt of that. On this day, 3 years ago, in the German city of Hanau, 9 persons have been brutally murdered by a far-right extremist who also shared strong anti-feminist attitudes in his so-called manifesto. Hanau was not a single incident, but part of an ongoing right extremist violence in Germany, in Europe, as well as globally. This violence is fueled by misogyny, white supremacy, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. It is connected to systems of oppression operating across borders.
So against the backdrop of the crises in Iran and Afghanistan, the Russian aggression in Ukraine, it is really important that we find new ways of how to deal with anti-feminism, of how we engage with anti-feminist regimes, and how we can better support feminist movements in anti-feminist regimes. Because the crises are clearly anti-feminist, so our responses need to be feminist. And this is what we are trying to do today, to find some answers to these questions. In a second, I have the great honor of welcoming US Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security, Bonnie Jenkins, to the stage for her opening remarks. And then my colleague Christina Lunz will lead you through the panel discussion and introduce our speakers. Thank you for being here with us today. Yes, please, Undersecretary, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good early morning to everyone here. Before I start, I just wanted to say how wonderful it is to be here, seeing friends, seeing just how far your organization has gone. I mean, I know we had conversations early on, I guess 3 years ago starting, during COVID, and we talked on Zoom. And to see where you are now and all the work you're doing is amazing. And Sanam, your organization as well, we've known each other for a while, also doing excellent work in this field. So it's an honor to be here. I've just been so impressed with the number of events on women and gender during these last 2.5 days. And I'm just so, this is my first Munich conference. I'm coming back, especially if these are the type of events that are going to be taking place. I certainly want to be here. So I just want to thank you. I just want to thank you, Nina, for your kind introduction. I would like to start by recognizing the amazing women who are on this panel and our gentleman who's also on the panel. And just all the untiring efforts of the entire feminist foreign policy community to create a more inclusive and sustainable national security infrastructure. I am sure that there are many who are questioning why the rise of anti-gender and anti-democratic movements pertain to my mandate in weapons of mass destruction, non-proliferation, disarmament, and arms control. I'm here to tell you that not only are gender and democracy important aspects of my work, but they are necessary if we are to create a comprehensive, stable, and sustainable security structure. Over the course of modern history, we have witnessed the disturbing global rise of anti-democratic sentiment, which has been exacerbated by conflict and crisis, including food, water, and climate instability. People living in anti-democratic societies who are lacking essentials needed to survive are turning to their governments to demand relief and assistance, but cannot receive it due to discriminatory practices and government restrictions on the enjoyment of human rights due to their race, religion, ethnicity, gender, and other identifiers. Evidence from sources such as the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs, UN Women, the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, and others have affirmed that an anti-democratic shift can be preemptively identified when the enjoyment of rights of those who are most marginalized is restricted. In many cases, these marginalized groups are ethnic, religious minorities, and women, girls, and gender-diverse persons in all segments of populations. Research suggests that restrictions on the enjoyment of rights of women and gender-diverse persons within a society lead to a more severe anti-democratic and pro-authoritarian regime. The implications of these actions go far beyond just affecting women's rights. They also contribute to actions that erode democratic structures, delegitimize gender equality policies, dismantle human rights protections, erode accountability mechanisms, and reduce the effectiveness of military and democratic safeguards. The more unstable these democratic structures become, the greater the chance of escalation of force, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, use of chemical biological weapons, the erosion of verification and compliance processes, and of course, erosion of human rights. Here is an example. A 2020 peer-reviewed paper from Stockholm University recognized that the more positive the associations between military strength, masculinity, and nuclear weapons possession, the stronger the indications of a targeted focus on proliferation. This author of the study, Dr. Emma Rosengren, used Sweden's disarmament policy in the 1960s, prior to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, as the research basis, and found that when gender bias is recognized as a factor of security policy, experts and policymakers were more able to assess and address these biases within their decision-making that could lead to skewed conclusions on effective strategies for non-proliferation. This led to an open recognition of the nuances that gender and identity played and contributed to the decision by Swedish authorities to steer toward a non-proliferation and disarmament when it had the chance to become a nuclear weapons power. I use this example to highlight just how important it is to understand various biases, and not just gender, but biases based on race, ethnicity, religion, origin, or identity that are deeply rooted within our policy making and how we go about countering them. This is also why the Women, Peace, and Security agenda is so crucial. Increasing the meaningful participation of women in all aspects and at all levels of decision-making will inevitably lead to a greater diversity of voices and perspectives that lend themselves to benefit the discussion and allow us to better develop solutions. I'm going to make it shorter because I know we want to get to our panel. So I just want to say that the tireless efforts of civil society space, of which we are here today, must not be overlooked as we look for ways of making it better, and for their determination in implementing evidence-based methods, from youth activists to journalists who risk their lives and freedoms to cover these issues, and to those who work with local grassroots organizations. Everyone's efforts and voices should be recognized and shared. I commend you all who are sitting on this panel, and those who organized this meeting today, and those who continue this vital work every day. Achieving peace and security is not simply casting a vote or taking a position on an issue. It requires leveraging everyone's interests, knowledge, and experience to craft sustainable solutions and policies. People of different genders and identities, whatever country, religion, or ethnic group they come from, look at the same issues through very different lenses, and that should be celebrated. The only way to achieve sustainable peace and lasting security for everyone is to ensure we have active and meaningful participation from everyone. Thank you very much. Again, it's such an honor for me to be here. Congratulations on all the work you're doing, and I look forward to the panel.
Thank you so much, Bonnie, for being here this morning, for being such a fantastic partner and ally. We appreciate it so much. And I especially appreciate that we wanted you to be here because we wanted for you to speak about the link between armaments, militarization, and anti-feminism. Because in our experience over the past few years that we've been doing the work on feminist foreign policy, and I'm pretty sure everyone who works on feminism, we again and again get to hear, okay, great, that's fun, feminist foreign policy, it's pink and glittery and cool, but like, we really, excuse me, we really don't have time now. In times of war, in times of increasing tensions around the world, we do not have time for feminist foreign policy. We need hard security. And then we as feminists, we stand by, we're like, wait, give me a second. So if I remember correctly, the feminist movement is the movement that for the past 200 to 250 years has been tackling violent structures in society. The feminist movement has always been about hard security, about how to make societies safer and less violent. It's always been about violence. So these attempts to delegitimize feminist work, to ridicule it, they are really strong and even stronger from those anti-feminists. So thank you for making this link, because feminist foreign policy since forever has been about hard security. It is my great honor now to ask the panelists on stage. You might be wondering about the setup here. We will hopefully have another panelist come in from Kabul. We will see if that's going to work out. That's been the plan. If not, I'll just take my chair and come closer to the rest. But now I would like to ask on stage, please, Sanam, Anderlini, Leandra Bias, and Gideon Rachman. Can I, before I introduce the panel, do we know already if we have her, or are we still trying? Okay, then I'll move a bit closer, and once we have her, you tell me, and then I move back. Okay. With me on stage, we have Sanam Anderlini. Sanam is the founder of the International Civil Society Action Network, and with decades of experience in women, peace building, and strengthening the feminist movement in international spaces. Leandra Bias. Leandra is a feminist academic who's been researching extensively on the authoritarianism and anti-feminism of the Russian regime. And Gideon Rachman. Gideon is the chief commentator of the Financial Times and the author of a book called The Age of the Strongman. And we also have, and I'm very, very happy that it's working, Mahbouba Seraj. Mahbouba is joining us from Kabul. Mahbouba is one of the most well-known women's rights activists from Afghanistan, and it's also our great, great honor to have you here on the stage, Mahbouba. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I would hope that my voice will also last today. Gideon, I'm going to start with you. Gideon, in your book, The Age of the Strongman, you are writing that we are currently experiencing the greatest assault on liberal democratic values since the 1930s. I would love for you to explain the statement, and really what I would like to hear now is a little overview of your whole book and the main themes.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. I'll try to be brief because we've got lots of other people on the panel. But so what I was trying to catalog in the book was what's called the kind of global democratic recession, which began around 2004 and has been quantified, this rollback in democratic regimes, the rise of authoritarian regimes, and to link it to what I call the rise of strongman politics, because the kind of feature of this current wave of authoritarianism is that it very often, in fact usually, is associated with a single strongman leader. And so I came across the strongly anti-feminist and anti-gay rights aspects of this almost by accident. Unlike people on the stage who've been thinking about this quite systematically, what I was trying to do was to do pen portraits of all of these people and to see what they had in common. And the more I kind of built on it, it became very obvious that anti-feminism was really quite central to them in very different political and social contexts and cultural contexts. But nonetheless, that was a common theme that you saw from Donald Trump to Putin to Modi to Xi Jinping. So I'll just run you through a few examples and just a couple of thoughts why that might be the case. Putin, I think, is the archetype both of this sort of strongman leadership. Is the first one. And as they try to build the image, you know, what do? They release a photo of him bare-chested with a gun. You know, you can't have a more traditional kind of view of masculinity than that. In Turkey, Erdogan, too, represents you know, the more kind of traditional male roles of Turkish society. I remember going to the Gezi Park demonstrations in 2013, and the kind of secularists who were demonstrating, there were women equally represented and no one wearing a headscarf. And the forces arrayed against them were much more traditionalists in their views. In China, Xi Jinping, it's quite striking. If you look at the new standing committee at the Politburo, 25 men, not a single woman. That's actually sort of going backwards. And he has made part of his campaign to reform society. He's asked television, for example, to not have effeminate men on television because they're negative role models. Moving on to India in 2014, Modi comes in, again, in a sort of Putin style, stresses masculinity. Part of the BJP's whole thing is the size of Modi's chest, his 56-inch chest, as part of their campaign sort of presentation that this is a real man. And then, of course, 2016, you get Donald Trump. And I think that was a very interesting moment because there were points in that campaign where Trump's gaffes, where conventional media, including people like me, would say, oh, well, he's finished now, you know, particularly after the famous grab them by the pussy comment, everyone said, well, you can't do that and be president. And what Trump demonstrated was actually he could. And not only, I mean, it's hard to prove, but I think that not only was that not a disqualifier in the hands of a lot of the voters, it may even have actually made him more attractive to some male voters because he was able to smash taboos, you know, this whole thing about political correctness. There are all these things you can't say anymore. Well, Trump was showing that he could say these things, get away with it, and I think that that was kind of attractive to a large section of the electorate. Moving swiftly onwards, I think Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia is an interesting figure. I mean, I think he's a strongman figure in that he has put his personality right at the center of a system that used to be slightly more collective. It was never democratic. He would present himself as, you know, somebody who has advanced women's rights, albeit in that, you know, very, very restrictive context. That's probably true, but he has also imprisoned a lot of women's rights activists because he wants to be the person who's handing these rights down. He's not going to encourage a broader societal movement. And then finally, Bolsonaro in Brazil, who came in 2018 now, can I say thankfully, out of power. But he too was somebody, you know, who, I remember just another anecdote, but the contrast, when he was clashing with Macron, his supporters were tweeting out photos of Bolsonaro's attractive young wife in contrast to Macron's older wife, and, you know, didn't that show you who was the better man, and so on. So it's really central to the way these guys present themselves. Why might that be the case? I think because they're reactionaries. They are people who generally say, the world was better before, and I'm going to take you back, make America great again. And in different ways, they're saying, make Russia great again, make China great again. And in some ways, that's to do with national power, but it's also to do with a traditionalist view of society, that society has gone wrong, that there's you know, all these crazy ideas out there, and we need to get back to common sense. And for them, common sense represents a society in which you know, gays are very firmly in the closet and women are in the kitchen, and that all this progress has to be rolled back, and let's get back to the way things were. And I think that is actually really pretty central to the appeal of these strongmen. And why might it be appealing? Well, I guess, you know, in times of rapid social change, there are going to be a lot of people who aren't happy with it, and that's their constituency. And just a final thought, and I want to, you know, hear from Kabul, but I didn't write about Afghanistan and Iran in the book because they didn't really quite fit the strongman template as I was writing about it. But it does strike me that as somebody who writes about foreign policy, it's an incredibly interesting development to see feminism actually not just a marginal, central to what's going on. You know, the Iranian sort of attempted revolution or revolt is about feminist issues. That's what started it, and obviously the major human rights concern in Afghanistan is now the rights of women. So you were saying that people were saying to you, oh, this is a marginal issue, you know, we can't really afford it. Well, these are two big global crises in which feminist issues are absolutely at the core of it.
Thank you, Gideon. And you wonderfully mentioned so many things that I want to kind of hand over to my other panelists about Putin. Leandre, you've been looking at that a lot. Then the kind of early warning signs that Gideon mentioned, and then one of the most awful examples of women's oppression as executed by the Taliban. Before doing that little round, Gideon, let me do that follow-up question. Data shows that we are just in the world, just democracies are just ahead of autocracies now. It's one to like very few democratic states more than authoritarian governed states. What's the outlook?
Well, it's hard to say, but I mean, I think that if Putin loses, that's a very important moment because he was the sort of forerunner of taking a country that we thought complacently had moved towards a democratic system and then rolling it back. And I think that it's also important to note that a lot of these states, I think Russia is now pretty clearly an authoritarian state, but a lot of the countries that we're talking about are kind of hybrid countries. So India would still claim to be the world's largest democracy, although if you look at, say, press freedom and things like that, they're being rolled back. But there are indices which take account of these because they will rate a democracy on different press freedom, judiciary, etc., etc. So you can see that although India is still formally an electoral democracy and has elements of free speech, that it's going backwards. And with India and China representing 40% of humanity, if you want to do it in that sense, the outlook's pretty grim, because I think they're both, albeit from very different starting points, but moving in the wrong direction.
Sanam, Gideon just talked about how Trump, despite the comments that he made, he was still elected president of the United States. When I think back to 2016, when the comments were made, as a feminist woman, I remember clearly reading all the international comments where they said no chance that he can still be president. I'm like, no, that's the story of the life of women, of all marginalized groups, that our rights are so strongly assaulted, and there's this huge impunity, because per definition, patriarchy is the ubiquity and impunity of male violence. So I was not surprised, and you, as someone who for decades has been working in the international field on conflict prevention, your work is a lot about early warning, about signs of when situations deteriorate. What is your experience from working with women peace builders around the world about early warning, about how these signs could have been, I think I have to say, been used to prevent conflicts, and why they're not?
Thank you very much. As I was listening, I was thinking there is such a disconnect between our universe and the work that we do and media and journalism, because I kept sitting there thinking, we could have told you. We had Turkish women who were warning about Erdogan at the time when the West was picking up and saying, oh, look, this is an Islamic democracy, and they were saying, no, it isn't. See the signs of what he's doing to women's rights. For me, just to take it back a step, this was very much kind of part of my life from when I was basically 11 years old, because that's when the Iranian Revolution took place, when I was 11. And it was fascinating because at that time we saw, so two things happened. One was, one of the galvanizing forces for the for the Islamist forces was that when the Shah, the previous regime, the Shah's government came up with changing laws on personal status for women to allow them divorce and custody of children and so forth. That was something that the Islamist forces took and said, look, this is an assault on our culture and our freedoms and our faith, and it's West-toxifying society, and it's bringing immorality and so forth. And it was a message that they took not only to men, but to women. And this is something that we see repeatedly, that extremist forces co-opt and coerce women. They're very good at co-opting women. They're very good at coming up and saying, you join us, and when we have the new society, when we have the new utopia, when we have an Islamic moral state, or whatever, you see it with Boko Haram, you see it with other forces, with the Taliban even, you will have a role in this. So that in Iran, this happened with the revolution. It was traditional conservative families, working class women who were part of enabling that revolution and giving it some level of legitimacy, if you want. And yet the first thing that they did was suspend those laws. And so the first force of resistance that came up against the Islamist regime were women, starting in 1979. My mother's generation were out on the streets protesting against the mandatory hijab. I went back when I was 18 years old, and I had to be covered. My face could show, but everything else was a shroud of black. And over the years, as I went back, it was women who were pushing back the scarf and tightening the clothes, and really it was dangerous. You could get, as we've seen with Masa Jina Amini 40 years later, but it was always, the pushback was always by women in public spaces, in education, in politics, in demanding legal changes, and yet the international community or the media never reported on this. And all of a sudden, they sort of woke up to it 6 months ago and said, oh, look, the Iranian women. No, it's been generations that this has been happening. And we have a poem in Farsi, which is about a little mountain stream that's trickling down from the, the spring waters, and it hits a black boulder. And it says to the boulder, would you mind moving aside so that I can carry on down? And the boulder says, absolutely not. I'm not getting out of your way. And so the water just trickles and slowly erodes away that rock and becomes a river. And this is what we're seeing in Iran 40 years on. It is 3 generations that have pushed us to the point that we're in. And what's extraordinary about the Iranian revolution specifically is that it's not just that it's women-led. We've seen that in Sudan, we've seen that in Yemen, we've seen it in Egypt, we saw it in Libya. What's interesting about this particular revolution is that that's the message of feminism, women, life, freedom, which has galvanized and mobilized across ethnicity, class, race, and across gender. It's the first time that we're seeing men stand shoulder to shoulder with women and with them. So this is not going to change. This is not going to go away there or elsewhere, and it's very important. Now, why did I bring that up vis-a-vis Trump and so forth? What we see across the world is that these movements, as I said, with the Iranian, they come in and they try and there's co-option of women because they know women have influence. There is coercion of women because they need to use women's bodies. They need the babies, they need the services that women provide and so forth. And then there are the women's rights activists and movements that fight back against them. So they're the first ones to warn and so forth. And what we saw in America is that the women who were co-opted were, sadly to say, white privileged women, right? The majority of white American women voted for Trump. And we have this concept that we see emerging, which is called the adjacency to power. It's this idea that, oh, if I'm with the strong man, I'm close to power, even though there might be violence associated with that. And this is something that in the States, we have still not dealt with it. What I'm seeing in America right now is that every American friend I have, their families are split between Trump supporters and non-Trump supporters, including many women, but it is overwhelmingly in white, affluent families. So we have to have a conversation within amongst women about solidarity, about recognizing each other's needs, about the fact that, for example, when you have reproductive rights assaulted, it's black and poor and marginalized women that are affected. It's not going to be the rich white kids because their mothers are going to fly them over somewhere else to get the abortions and so forth. So there is a division there. And one of the other, just to add, just so that we have other points to bring up, it's easy to say, oh, authoritarians and extremist forces assault women's rights and try and co-opt and coerce. Let's not forget that democratic forces also do the same. At the end of the day, it was a democratically elected government that said, oh, for the women's rights women's rights in Afghanistan, we're going to go to war. Right? So women's rights are used constantly, and the force of women is being used essentially by patriarchal political forces to their benefit. And the question and the challenge that we have in the women's movements is, how do we keep our space and make sure that we don't get co-opted one way or another, but actually we become the radical force of change and transformation? Because when we think about peace movements, we're not just asking for peace for me and you. We're asking for peace for men. We don't want our boys to go to war. We don't want our men to go to war. We don't want war, full stop, right? That's radical equality. And that's the space that feminist movements are in. And of course, it means you're challenging all forms of status quo, and nobody likes it, and therefore the attacks are also significant.
The phenomenon you just mentioned about co-opting women's rights also for military interventions, it has a name, it's called embedded feminism. Embedded feminism was used, as you said, for the intervention in Afghanistan. Around the 15th of August 2021, when Kabul fell to the Taliban, you tweeted something that said something along the lines, oh, all of a sudden the whole world seems to be interested in women's rights and what's happening to the women in Afghanistan, but where were you when the women were actively excluded from the Doha peace process? We have now a situation, Mahbouba, and I'm so grateful you're joining us from Kabul, where in Afghanistan we see the largest assault on women's rights. It's the only country in the world where girls are not allowed to go to school. Mahbouba, can you kindly fill us in about what is happening in Afghanistan at the moment? And yeah, let's start there.
Thank you, and I hope you will be able to hear me. I don't know how much you can hear me there. Can you hear me well?
We can hear you, thank you.
You hear me?
Can you try? Yes, I think we can hear you.
If you can hear me, then I don't know.
I think we might have some technical issues, unfortunately.
Yeah, we do. We do. I'm having a very bad connection today.
Would you, it will be unfortunate, but would you try switching off the video maybe for a second so at least we can hear what you're saying?
Just switch off the video?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Is that okay? Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So please, if you can repeat your question.
Mahbouba, we see that the largest assault on women's rights is happening in Afghanistan, which is the only country in the world now where girls are not allowed to go to school. What is the situation in Kabul, where you are based in Afghanistan? If we can start with this question, please.
Thank you so much. You are absolutely correct. Afghanistan is the big country in the world at this point with the largest assault on women and girls of that country, because they are stopped from going to school. And that is something that is not really happening anywhere else and Afghanistan is the only country that is doing that. The women of Afghanistan are in a very bad at this point. Mentioned yesterday, there are two governments right now going on, the two de facto governments. One the de facto government is the Taliban, as the other de facto government is the Muslims. And the UN and Taliban both they haven't been able to help Afghanistan in any way, shape, or form. Really, to get this through, I don't know.
Mahbouba?
If the conference, the meeting, the get-togethers, and what...
Mahbouba, can you hear me?
Because we are standing on a cliff, and that is on the edge of that cliff, that is the poverty. of corn is going to eat us alive.
Mahbouba, can you
when
hear
we
me?
push it to that poverty,
There doesn't seem any
we
link
will
between
be,
us and her
will
anymore,
be
right? No.
absolutely destroyed, because poverty, the worst thing about poverty is that people who are struggling with poverty, they don't really think of anything else. They don't think of the human rights.
This is so unfortunate. Will we be trying to get her in again? Yeah, are we? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you. That is really unfortunate. Sanam, before handing over to you, Leandra, Sanam, maybe you can try to fill in and give a response, because I just mentioned the tweet. Maybe you can explain your intention behind the tweet in August 2021.
Sure. So, you know, from the time, first of all, the narrative around Afghanistan is really interesting, because it was, women's rights was used as one of the excuses to go in, but then in the US, it all of a sudden became kind of forgotten in that as the politics took over, there was a lot of work that was done, but it was always the story of, oh, Afghan women need empowerment, okay? They perpetually needed empowerment. Meanwhile, in the last 20 years, we have had a generation of Afghan women getting educated, being in school, so that by the time of the fall of Kabul, 62% of the Afghan population was under the age of 25. Over 40% are under the age of 14. It's a young country. So first of all, we've abandoned basically a bunch of kids and very young people. But within that population, we saw women lawyers, women journalists, women judges, women activists, women social workers, teachers across the country. And these women and the groups, the organizations that at ICAN we were working with and others, for years they had been saying, do not trust the Taliban. There is no Taliban 2.0. They are the same guys. They're the same things. Let us in the spaces where negotiations are happening. The people we work with, because they're peace activists, weren't saying, don't talk to the Taliban. They understood that this is a social force that exists for whatever reason. They were saying, we want to be at the table. We want to be at the table because we don't want to be on the table, right? Who excluded them? It was the United Nations, it was the United States, it was every single country that has been involved in that conflict, in the warring spaces. They were stonewalled out of the talks in Doha. They were stonewalled by the Qataris, they were stonewalled by the US envoy. It is a kind of a collective guilt and a collective lack of responsibility, and their lives were literally handed over. There were times when, at the Doha talks, they were sitting there and releasing 5,000 Taliban prisoners, allowing the release, or pushing the Taliban, Afghan government to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners, when the Taliban was bombing maternity clinics and girls' schools and universities. So the issue of civilian protection was just not on the table. And you have to say, what on earth was going on, and how did they not anticipate this? So women were kept out. And in all the political spaces I go in now, I say, if Afghan women had been at the table, would things be this bad? And everyone sits there and goes, no. Right? So it's a lesson, and yet we repeat it with Yemen and Syria and all the other conflicts. We're still excluding women. So that's one thing. The second issue is that you now have people like Mahbouba who are still active on the ground. Again, an incredibly important layer of educated, experienced Afghan women have had to leave. Organizations like mine ended up being involved in evacuation because others weren't. I was calling the White House and saying, we have police officers, women police officers. Who's getting them out? No one. They all had NATO certificates. Where was NATO? They're not there, right? So women's organizations have led the effort of trying to bring and save Afghan women, but you can't bring 20 million people out. And what's happening now is like people like Mahbouba and others who are there are trying to kind of regroup and figure out what do we do now and how do we look after people. And a key message that we were advocating to the international community was, Number one, make sure that your humanitarian assistance is gender responsive. That means you send women in to do the assistance, you make sure that women are part of the provision of the assistance, you make sure that women are part of the recipients of the assistance, because we also know, by the way, that through women, men and boys and others get the food. That's one of the key reasons why we talk about this. But if you don't have access to women, how are they going to get assistance, right? So we said, send women in and make sure that you're hiring and working with women on the ground. We saw men, delegations of men, delegations. There was one picture that I saw which was hilarious. It was 3 Talib guys, bearded, and on the other side were 3 English diplomats, and all of them sort of bald and you know, with their, I don't know, blue ties. I mean, it was like mirrors of each other. I was thinking, why are we doing this? Why are we not sending in, from our societies, women who speak Pashto, women who speak Farsi and Dari, women who know Islam? Because we know when they turn around and they say, oh, this is Sharia law, we can turn around and say, I'm sorry, sir, that's absolute nonsense. Sharia law actually says you educate people, right? So there is this disconnect from the international community and the persistence of irresponsibility. Now, the terrible thing about apart from what's happening in Afghanistan, the terrible thing that is also occurring is that when the Taliban de facto beat NATO, the message to other extremist groups around the world and to authoritarian forces was that, look, this is how it gets done. We immediately saw Islamist forces in other countries arising and saying, oh, child marriage, the Taliban says it's okay to do it. Oh, women, you know, the Taliban says a woman has to go out with a mahram. That's the same thing that should be happening here, because that's Islam. So what happened in Afghanistan hasn't stayed in Afghanistan. We saw the rise of authoritarianism. I was talking to a Ukrainian a few months ago, and I said, to what extent do you think that the pullout from Afghanistan, the way it was done, was, you know, a catalyst for Russia pushing into Ukraine, because they know that there isn't going to be any pushback, right? So we've had a spike in extremism, the rise of authoritarianism, and by virtue of the fact that we in the West or in the North, or however you want to call it, democratic countries, didn't stand by our own principles of human rights and so forth, we have eroded the rule-based order. We have eroded our own credibility in terms of human rights and women's rights. The UK evacuated 200 cats and dogs at a time when we were desperately saying, please get these women out. 200 cats and dogs got pulled out. Afghan women didn't. How do you stand up and say, oh, we stand up for human rights and women's rights? So this is the state that we're in the aftermath of Afghanistan, and no one wants to talk about it because the blame rests in democratic spaces.
Thank you for filling in, Sanam. Gideon, how many of your minutes do we have left before you have to rush to the airport early?
I've got to go actually a couple of minutes, yeah.
Okay, then Leandra, please bear with me as I'm going first back to Gideon. Gideon, maybe just before you rush off, we heard before, also from Sanam, kind of the disconnect between women's rights activists, human rights defenders, and media. You're a journalist. What can be your impact, if you intend so, to actually help change the narrative and get kind of the feminist views in and the feminist analyses of what's been happening around the world? Because it is frustrating, not only in 2016 when we read the commentators about, oh, Trump has no chance to win, when feminists and human rights defenders around the world have such a different understanding of the situation.
Well, I mean, I think that you can look at it two ways. Oh, sorry. You can look at it two ways. I mean, I think, firstly, what happens inside newsrooms, but also what's happening in the world. By which I mean, I do think that certainly, you know, I've not been in this business a long time, and there's been a definite change in the way that people think about diversity over the last 5 years. Much more pressure. You know, we never used to count gender or race on the op-ed page, like you'd commission a piece, and now it's very central to how people think. So there's a shift in how newsrooms behave, and I expect that will continue. But also I think that you can make the intellectual argument for why these issues are central, that they're not, as you were saying, some kind of marginal thing and nice to have, tick that box and on to the real stuff. That if you look at what the people in the Bayerische Hof would regard as major international crises, Iran, Afghanistan, that women's rights are absolutely at the core of them, and therefore it's not a sort of politically correct box-ticking thing to say, well, let's have a feminist perspective. Actually, it's, if you want to understand these issues, you really have to. And so I think, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't give up, put it that way. I think things are basically moving in your direction. But
you're contributing to that change?
Yeah, I mean, I'm part of it, I suppose, because I'm sitting there in the newsroom, yeah.
Thank you for that. And thank you for being here.
Yeah, and I apologize for having to get to the airport, but thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Gideon. Thank you. Leandra, Gideon talked about Putin before. He said he's the archetype of the strongman. Starting in around 2000, his behavior has really been copied by many of the others he mentioned, Erdogan, Modi, Duterte, Bolsonaro, and so forth. You've written a very widely read article on the International of the Anti-Feminists. In that article, you write that there's a direct link between the bare-chested Putin riding on a horse and his war of aggression against Ukraine. Can you please explain that link to us?
Yes, sure. And I'm glad to say, because the article was originally published in German, but actually on the February 24th, it's coming out in English as well. So I hope it will be received a bit more widely still. But yes, and it goes along with what has been said in this room already. These are things feminists have raised for over a decade by now. And it is really the central argument being that at the core of the authoritarian system in Russia is anti-feminism. And we can see that not essentially from the very, very beginning, but definitely at the latest since 2012. At 2012, we are reaching a point where Putin rises again for the third time to the office of president with very rigged elections, and Russia is facing the widest protests ever since the fall of the Soviet Union. So you have a regime that feels incredibly threatened, and which then decides, okay, we need to stabilize power, right? And one very effective way, and I'll come to why that actually works, is to push against feminism and to nib democratization in the bud, because that's why it works. So you start seeing in Russian official discourse and also in policies that then come from that, really, we are defending traditional values, right? So when you look at when that comes, that is around 2012, and it then starts also being at the forefront of Russian diplomacy within the UN, within the Council of Europe. So it is very much this narrative, actually, we need to defend our unique traditional values, which are inherently patriarchal. And by extension, why is this even used? It's used because it's such a beautiful shortcut against democracy. Because the way it goes is saying, well, gender equality, LGBT rights, all of that is nothing than a Western perversion. So it's something that is external, which, first of all, that is a total silencing of the own Russian feminist history. And if we had more, I would hold a whole lecture, because it's rich, it's very rich, and it's part of every single system to erase that memory again, right? So first is to say this is a Western invention, it's a perversion, and most of all, it's a very canny ruse to destroy us from within, right? So you bring this into our very virgin, that's some of the words that are used, our virgin societies, to make us implode. Because if this works, then of course you have racketing divorce rates, you will have falling birth rates, all of that, right? And essentially it's against nature, and hence the entire nation will be destroyed. So that is the first allegation. This is Western, it's perverse, it's a strategy to destroy us, and now is actually the crucial point. By extension, everything that is Western, including democracy, is nothing than a facade to make us destroy. So in one statement, you essentially sweep away all of human rights, rule of law, and democracy, and you say everything that is being promoted by the West is just a geopolitical strategy. So that is why it is done. It is effective because we know, as you said in the opening statement, one correlation that we can prove, of course, is the higher gender equality, the less violent the society. But also, and crucially, the more women and ethnic minorities are represented in a popular uprising and in the democratization process later, the longer that democracy actually holds. And we see in revolutions where women were sidelined afterwards, these did not consolidate. Or it took a very long time, if you take the French Revolution, until it became an actual democracy, right? So it is smart and essential for autocrats to go against feminism, against women's rights from the very beginning. That is one reason why this works. It is also extremely effective in diplomatic terms because this gives you this opens the door for alliances with the global South, unfortunately. Precisely because we have not been in the Western Hemisphere coherent with promoting human rights and defending them. They have been instrumentalized. We need to acknowledge that, right? And so in that opening, not an opening speech, in the speech on the 24th of February, where he had a paragraph, Vladimir Putin had a paragraph on this invasion is also in the name of defending our traditional values because essentially Ukraine has already been perverted. So if that succeeded, if Ukraine succeeded in staying independent and become a democracy, hence, you know, the gender ideology and this Western perversion would sort of spill over into Russia. Then comes a whole 3 paragraphs where you can clearly see that he is switching audience and he is now speaking to communities, people, leaders in the global South, where he is saying, we have the right to define our own culture, we have the right to say what our norms and values are, and we will not stand by yet another wave of Western interventions. And that works. That does work. And we can see it even at the Munich Security Conference. We can see that even when you have Global South as a topic, well, it's still a marginal topic. And you can also see how governments in the Global South do not consider Ukraine a priority for legitimate reasons sometimes. Because they do, unfortunately, where you have a history of lived, embodied experience of Western imperialism, then sometimes the argument actually works of maybe Putin is right. So that is clever. So the whole point I'm making about why this agenda has come, right, of Russia saying we're defending our traditional values, it works because it creates resonance abroad. It works effectively because you hinder democratization in your own country. And it works, of course, because it's also a pretext to push against any sort of activists within your own country. And that was sort of the phases that we saw first. First, it was just a discourse. Then you started seeing attacks against feminists. And then, of course, you also started seeing, because let's face it, right, it's not 1 year, it's almost a decade by now, but you start seeing military intervention in Ukraine, very much in the name of that. And I'll just say one last remark, because yes, he said that on the February 24th last year, but already with the Euromaidan, the very first comment that came out of Russia is that this is a gay revolution. This is Western orchestrated, but it is a gay revolution. It is not about democracy. And that is how it's twisted, right? That is how this is no longer about a country that just dares dares to say we are self-determined and we choose a different path. And it's no longer about an authoritarian neighboring regime that has never taken you, that has never respected you feeling threatened. But now it's all of a sudden this virgin, threatened Russian nation that is essentially where the real issue is Western neo-colonial imperialism, and all we are doing here is leading a preventive strike.
What an overview. Thank you, Leandra. And you've been opening up many new ways of talking about the topic you mentioned. I'd love, maybe in a second, to hear more about the Russian feminist movement, if there's any left. When you mentioned partnerships, immediately to my mind, and maybe also many in the audience, of course, came the alliance between the murderous Russian regime, the murderous Iranian regime, and how they're supporting each other also by sending drones in murdering people. But I really want to get back to you, Mahbouba, as long as hopefully this connection stays clear now. Mahbouba, you started before talking about how in Afghanistan there really now are two Taliban, and then it kind of cut off. If you can continue there.
I was not saying. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
I was not talking about two Taliban. I was talking about two de facto governments. One of them being the Taliban, and the other one of them being United Nations and the international community. Because they are both powerful and they are both doing whatever they want and they whatever. So the people of Afghanistan, the women, the children, the men, everybody, now has to find a way between these two, and see which side they really want to go to. The international community or the Taliban. So that's where we are. And the woman's role actually is diminishing every day. The Taliban don't want us. The international community, the first thing they do when an order comes from the Taliban guy from Kandahar, they stop everything in Afghanistan. Like their work, they can close their NGOs, they can go to Pakistan, and that's it. And everything stops. So we are really between a stone and a hard place.
Mahbouba, at a different event on Friday night, the German feminist foreign minister Annalena Baerbock, she spoke about kind of the challenge that someone like herself is facing. For example, when it came to when just before Christmas the Taliban announced that women were no longer allowed to work in international NGOs, and the dilemma of still providing humanitarian aid or not, and how to deal with the situations like allowing for poverty and allowing for poverty to increase, or potentially supporting policies put in place by the Taliban. What do you expect from the international community?
Well, what I expect from international community is for them to know that they are international community. In other words, whatever the Taliban are saying, they're going to be saying, you know, that's going to be happening all the time. But the international community has a responsibility to the people of Afghanistan. So they have to continue, find ways of doing what they are supposed to, or why, or the reason why they are here. They have to do that. They have to do their job. Because otherwise, people are going to die in Afghanistan. And I don't think the international community at this point would like to have the death of thousands of the Afghan people on their conscience. So for that matter, they have to find ways, they have to make it possible for the women to work, because right now the aid is not really getting to where it's supposed to be, because the women are not involved. So these are important. And they have to say to the Taliban that this is how we work. And the Taliban, one way or another, are going to accept it. Because you see, Taliban are not such a huge power to control the whole of Afghanistan. You know, they are maybe 300 to 400,000 people, and we are a 40 million population. So even right now, whatever is happening all over Afghanistan is not the same. In one area is one thing, another area is something else, in another in one province is one thing, in another province is something else, even in city of Kabul. In some parts there is, you know, is terrible things that are happening. In some parts life is normal. So these are the things that from the international community we are expecting to know, to plan, to work accordingly.
Thank you, Mahbouba. I'm Leandra. Before opening up to a few questions, in your work, you focus a lot on how those partnerships that you mentioned before, of the anti-feminists, of the authoritarian regimes. One very prominent one at the moment is Iran, Russia-Iranian regime, Russian regime. Can you fill us in quickly a little bit more about how well connected these autocratic anti-feminist movements are, and how big this movement actually is, or collaboration?
But I have to admit that I'm not a specialist on Iran and how they are connected. So it's much more what some have called under different names, like is it anti-gender campaigns, is it anti-gender mobilizations or networks, right? And they come together in different forms, but one is definitely the World Congress of Families, which was actually founded many years ago, still in the mid-90s, but it became very, very strong around 2013. And originally, this was a more of a Christian evangelical movement, and they are still extremely strong, and so coming from the US, and originally it would be convening, you know, in the US, and as time grew, this has become extremely international. And just to make you understand what we are dealing here with is really that, I'm not quoting exactly, but this is a movement that says, it's an organization that says we want to promote the nuclear family as the only natural order of the world, something like that. So, and from there we can tell what this is about, right? So this is a movement, this is a network that is going to, and is actively pushing against abortion rights, reproductive rights more generally, obviously pushing against same-sex marriage, etc., etc. But essentially it is also a movement that has become really international. And so two things that we are seeing is that at first it might have been a very localized organization. Now you see regional conferences, and you see how they are spreading exponentially, especially in Latin America and in Africa. And we also see Russia's heavy involvement around 2013. So again, when there was this switch to, okay, how do we strengthen our regime? We need to have these coalitions and we need to push against women's rights in the first place. So when you trace money, and this is not work I have done, but this is work by investigative journalists, and if you're interested, it's the 50-50 project in open democracy, for instance, you can really see how two Russian oligarchs are among the biggest donors. And actually one of the big questions we are having as researchers now is what will be the future role of Russia in the World Congress of Families? Because they've been extremely leading in pushing topics, devising agendas, and you really have to imagine that this is an organization that not only funds doctors who, for instance, in Italy, you have 60% of doctors who refuse abortion based on conscience. Right? So this is an organization who then funds their trials, for instance. But it's also an organization that has reached a point where they push in the European Court for Human Rights for arguments that they know are not going to be successful. But that is not the agenda. They're doing it to change the discourse, to actually make those issues debatable. And they have the resources to do that. So the question mark we have is, now Russia is really internationally isolated, and we are witnessing tensions also within the World Congress of Families, and it's not clear whether they will continue being in a leading role, and so who will step in?
Mahbouba, Sanam, if any of you would also like to comment on this collaboration, yeah.
So I take it back further. Basically, after the 1995 Beijing conference and the platform for women that came out, I was at the UN in 2000 when we were advocating for what became 1325. What we saw,
Women, Peace and Security.
the Women, Peace and Security Council resolution. And what we saw there at the Commission on the Status of Women, it was literally one day to the next, there was an army of evangelical men and women, young men and women, who came into the UN spaces. And it was very coordinated. They were going after the issues of reproductive rights and health and so forth. They had very coordinated caucuses. And in subsequent years, we saw there was the pre-conference organizing that would be happening. And it was an alignment of the Vatican, many Islamic states, including those that are allies with the West on, on issues, but actually on other issues, they're incredibly regressive, Saudi Arabia and others. And they would coalesce, they would align in terms of what issues they were going to push back against. And we would see this in the CSW negotiations and so forth. So that was one area. The next iteration that we saw was when Poland joined the EU, and instead of the position being that you join the EU and the standards of the EU are here and the values are here, it was pulling it down. So all of a sudden we saw the entire EU bloc being pulled down to the standards that Poland was pushing, which was again very much kind of along the lines of the Catholic Church and being very, very regressive. So at the international level, we've seen huge coordination along these lines, and the use of culture is very interesting, because I think one of the weaknesses in feminist movements is that we have not claimed our cultural space and our heritage and the history that from which we have grown. And by just relying on the law, we've ceded that space to these other forces. So to me, the reason why, and I'll share with you some other stories from Iranian culture and heritage, but we need to re-anchor and reclaim with kind of confidence our own histories and cultures, and do some social archaeology, because every country you look at, there has been strong women's presence in their history and traditions and so forth, including in Afghanistan and elsewhere. But part of the way in which these guys push back is to basically try and erase that and then make it seem as if these ideas are coming from the quote-unquote West. And the irony is that the West really doesn't care about the women's rights of anybody, actually, in most countries, right? It's useful when it needs to be, but it's not necessarily a priority elsewhere. So that issue of culture, I think, is being manipulated.
As we're shortly running out of time, I will open up to 2 questions in a second. And Mahbouba, back to you, and I'm just so sorry. you've not had the kind of the airtime that you deserve and that we wanted to have from you because we were not able to manage a good connection. When the connection broke down before, Sanam briefly mentioned about how the assault on women's rights and the oppression through the Taliban, how this has the potential or has impacted other countries or autocratic regimes. Can you comment on that? What impact this has beyond Afghanistan?
Yeah, it's extremely dangerous for the world, really. Like right now, for what is happening in Afghanistan, like Indonesia is kind of doing that. And then I believe there's Yemen is another one also. So, you know, these are the things that it will continue in the world. Because one thing we should not forget, and that is we are living in the men or the calling or they are the ones who have the power. So whatever we do, the men will find a way, especially in the slum.
I'm sorry, Mahbouba is literally one of the most outspoken and well-known women's human rights defenders, and I wish we could have heard more from her. I'm opening up to the floor now. We have time for roughly 2 questions. Marianne says 2 max. 2 minutes. Okay, let's see. Do we have another mic? If not, I'll walk around. Yeah, perfect. Then Nahid, you have the first one.
Hi. My question is, there are these movements that we're all talking about in Iran, in Afghanistan, especially in that region. I'm going to stick to that. In order for it to be effective, the next phase would be to cross-pollinate them. Afghanistan and the Afghan women movements around the world, networks, we have a lot more experience in this because we've been in it many, many times in the last decades. So how do you see ICAN, CFFP, how do you see the future of, let's say, the next months, because it'll be a lot of movement. How can we cross-pollinate these movements, these committees, in order to achieve that what we're after, or at least the first phase of it, because it's going to be a long fight. So is there some kind of a strategy in your minds to say, okay, we're here, what's next? But the how is extremely important. How can we cross-pollinate, learn from each other, get these women together, but also work for the region? And not only because it's like a big red circle. Any thoughts on that? Because I think that the policymakers would have to need that how in order to do, you know, the right policies, hopefully, and national policies towards Afghanistan, towards Iran, where the women are at the center of it.
Thank you, Nahid. Nahid herself, Canadian Afghan women human rights defender, best-selling author, amongst others of the book We Are Still Here, about the stories of Afghan women. A question over there.
Can you hear me up there without the mic?
But for the live stream, we use the mic, and if you can briefly introduce yourself.
So I'm Joshua Walker. I'm president of Japan Society. It's awkward as a man to be asking this direct question, but I think your point's really important. I work in an environment in Japan that the word feminist has a problem. And you already alluded, Sanam, in the American context, I come from a Christian evangelical background. My parents are missionaries in Japan. That's why I grew up in Japan. So I resonate with everything you said, but going to my own family and discussing this panel and some of the way I've heard my European friends talk about this is very complicated. So if we're going to bring allies along, and I've worked in the State Department, and I'm so excited to see Bonnie and other friends here, how do we create a space that rather than just kind of rah-rah, we get on the main stage and are not having the conversation here next time?
Well, that is actually the plan, the main stage. Thank you. Over to both of you, if you would.
So I'll start there and then come here. You know, for the years that I've been in this space, I have tried to avoid all the ists that people want to label you, because that's a way of trying to control what you can and can't do, or where you're meant to be and where you're not meant to be. The word feminist itself, you're right, it is super contentious, because in the network that I run, we have partners in 40 countries around the world, and they're places of conflict and where violent extremism and war is, and authoritarianism is prevalent. And we ask our partners every once in a while, do we want to call ourselves, the Women's Alliance for Security Leadership, WASL, which means connect? Do we want to say we're a feminist movement? And you ask your Egyptian colleagues, and they say, no, we can't say feminist, because in Egypt, to say feminist means that you want men to have babies, right? So we're like, we don't want to get into those discussions to try and now explain labels and so forth. But there is, so what we've tried to do is to say things like, and I have this conversation with my own nephews, and do you want to go to war as a young man? No, I don't want to go to war. I said, that's what I work on. I work on making sure that we, neither the girls nor the boys, have to face the prospect of war, because the equality agenda that we've had up to now, in many Western and I would say Anglo-Saxon contexts, feminism has been limited to, we want equality in the status quo. That means if we're going to go to war, then girls should be drafted to go to war as well. That's equality. Maybe some people want that, that's fine. But the radical agenda, or the feminist agenda, is that we don't want $3 trillion spent on weapons. We want it to be for human security. We want it to be for the environment. We don't want to have to be dealing with conflict always through the use of force. We should be amping up diplomacy and dialogue and so forth. So it's really unpacking the labeling and then bringing it back. But there is also a question from the flip side of that to say, why are people so allergic to the idea of feminine or feminist or women's leadership? And I would say that the irony is, when we talk about strongmen, these strongmen are really afraid of women, right? Strongmen, their kryptonite is women. And this is something that the Western world needs to understand. That's why you need to be listening and bringing women's movements, women's activists to the spaces including over there, because we bring a different perspective and we bring a different way of looking at the issues. So I think that it's both from the feminist side, thinking about, okay, how do we have the conversations, but it's from the other side to just take down the sexism, racism, etc., and actually listen to what is underneath the messages and the work that's being done.
Do you also want to comment on Nahid's question?
That's a long conversation, how we do this. So again, in the network that I run, we have, since COVID, every week we were doing weekly calls, and people were sharing strategies across the network. And now we do them every 2 weeks. Our Afghan colleagues are part of this. We have something called the She Builds Peace campaign. And it's really been a way to enable our partners to go to their own communities and share what it means to do, as women, what it means to do peace-building work. And by the way, peace work is really, really dangerous, difficult work to do. But they're learning, so there's a lot of cross-learning that's happening. We at ICAN pull together resources and ideas, and we're going to be documenting methodologies to share that out. We also make animations to share information. The outreach, to be honest with you, from where I sit, we have not worked with the Iranian women's movement, because sanctions don't let us, right? It's really, we can't get, there's, even communication is hard, let alone trying to get resources and so forth. And secondly, as being Iranian myself and having done research and having kind of my own history of challenges with the regime, I never wanted to put Iranian women in danger because of being associated with me. So it's, for me, it's been I watch it, I observe it, I see what's happening and so forth. But as an organization, I believe that as outsiders, one of our key roles has to be that do no harm. And so I don't want association with me to be harmful to folks on the ground, that's something that that we have to deal with. But sanctions are a horrific barrier, and sanctions right now with Afghanistan are also causing huge barriers for connectivity and so forth. But we are working a lot with Afghan women.
The final 1 minute goes to you, Leandra, and your closing thoughts. No pressure.
Yeah, great. No, the only thing that I wanted to flag, because it came up at the beginning and then we sort of forgot about it, and I think it's very tempting but also very dangerous to keep focusing on the real autocrats, the real strongmen, those that are actually dangerous, is really to bring us back to also, we mentioned Poland and Hungary, yes, those are important examples, but it's within this country as well. It is with the country that I come from, Switzerland, which is always weird, right? Because we are the small neighboring country. But we have right now a right-wing populist party that has just announced that we have elections this year, their entire program will be an anti-gender program. So this is real, and it is happening within what we consider consolidated democracies. So now at the very latest is the time for policymakers to take feminist research and activists seriously, because we have been pointing to where the source of democratic erosion is, and it is in the fight against women's and LGBT rights.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining the stage. Thank you.
So what I'm saying will be just fine. So what you mean will be alright. So what you saying, so what you saying will be just fine. So sweet like Krispy Kreme, so smooth like Mr. Softee. Come down the street, I got cash money. Let's